students, welcome to another home-based lesson. So for this HBL, we'll be going through Essay 4 and Essay 5 in your revision package. So this is basically Essay 4A, question 4. So this question is a question on inflation. I will give you some time to read the question now. So if you ask me, right, this question, why did it end up being the most popular question for the A-level candidates who did the A-level exam in 2019? This question turned out to be the most popular question, mainly because it tested both the causes as well as the cures for inflation. Okay, a lot of students are very comfortable in explaining what caused demand pull inflation, what caused cost push inflation, and of course they are very well prepared for any economic policies, especially in Singapore, that handles the problem of inflation. So you can see the great contrast to the 2009 A-level question, where none of the macro questions was on policy. So this year, this question was especially popular. So let's zero in on part A for this video. Part A, right, the question is asking you to explain a possible demand side reason and a possible supply side reason for the rise in the rate of inflation. So take note of the word and, okay, the connecting word and. To get all 10 marks, right, you need to explain both demand pull as well as cost push. And note that this question is purely theoretical, so you need not link to the Singapore context, unlike for part B. But of course, if you can exemplify with Singapore, that would be great. So our advice is to use separate ADAS diagrams for each of the explanation, each of these two reasons. So if you still recall your essay skills package, right? To do well in this question, right, I recommend the use of SEED. That means state, explain, exemplify with diagram to get the best analytical depth. So when it comes to the exemplification, right, it is probably easier for most students to use Singapore to exemplify. And since you are talking about demand reason for the first, since you are going to shift the AD to the right, you can at least state a succinct, a brief explanation of the multiply effect. However, because this question is to show demand pull inflation, when you do your multiple shifts of the aggregate demand curve, right, you have to make sure you at least shift it along the diagonal part of the AS curve so you can actually show the general price level going up. And of course, when you want to draw the diagram, a lot of students, right, we tend to get a lot of feedback from the Cambridge markers year after year that students often label the aggregate demand, but they somehow forget to label aggregate supply. So make sure you put the AS curve in label AS in your graph. So let's do the AD shift together. Okay, so you draw your axis. This is real national income. This is general price level. So you can draw the horizontal, the diagonal, and the vertical. So remember to label AS curve. So this is basically your YF. You are going to start from somewhere here. Okay, so you can do a simple multiple shift where each shift is a bit smaller and smaller. Let's say somewhere here. Okay, AD1, AD2, AD3. So your first job is to explain how could the aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Okay, so this is where you can use the example of Singapore. One thing we have always been telling you every month, right, so far last year as well as this year, that Singapore is basically a small and open economy. That means if our AD were to shift to the right, one of the major reasons is because our trading partner, they are doing very well in their economic growth. So when they're doing very well, okay, their income, their real GDP will rise. And because we are selling exports to them, we are exporting to them, And it turns out that our exports are mostly income elastic goods. So now that you have studied international trade, now that you have completed international trade, I hope you can understand better that Singapore's comparative advantage tend to be on things like manufactured goods, electronic goods, as well as services. All these goods and services are typically income elastic. So that means when the trading partners' real GDP were to increase, the demand for exports will increase by more than proportionate. So when that happens, right, our net export should increase and hence it will shift the aggregate demand to the right. Okay, and when you want to explain the multiplier, you could just say that when our AD shift to the right because the net exports increase, the first group of Singaporeans to receive a higher income will be those Singaporeans who are directly working in the export sector, those sectors that actually sell these electronic goods that provide these services to the rest of the world. So, and then when their income goes up by that amount of the rise in the export revenue, they are going to spend a fraction of their income given by the marginal propensity to consume. So this will lead to a rise in income for another group of Singaporeans. I like to use the restaurants as a simple example. So you can think of those Singaporeans who work in the export sector. They earn the income from the export earnings from the higher net exports, and they are able to spend it, okay, lead to a rise in induced C, right? They spend some of the income in the restaurant going out to eat. So when they spend, right, that becomes in that rise in induced C becomes the income of the Singaporeans who are working in the restaurants. Okay, these are the chefs, the waitresses, okay, the cashiers. All these people will receive another income, and again they will spend another fraction of income. So that's why the aggregate demand continue to increase because of the induced consumption. So when that happens, right, what you can do is this: why would general price level go up? Okay. Now, when the everyone starts to spend, right? When the export earnings rise, when people start to spend, a lot of firms in Singapore will face what we call an unplanned fall in inventories. Okay, they'll find that the stocks of goods will go down as the exports increase or as people spend more and more, let's say, on restaurant. So what a lot of these firms want to do is that they want to replenish the fall in inventories, they want to produce more output. So in order to do that, right, they have to hire more workers, right? So, but when they do that, right, it's harder and harder for firms to find all these unemployed FOPs the closer you are to the full employment level of national income. So what this means is that the factor costs, the wage cost, the rental cost, the interest cost, all these are going to go up. So firms are going to pass the higher factor costs to the consumers in the form of higher prices of goods. So if you can explain as precisely as what I'm doing now, it is very clear from the Cambridge markers that you are giving a analytical answer to your this part of the question. So this is basically what you must do to get the marks for the demand side reason. So as for the supply side reason, right, let's draw the ADAS curve together. So let me remind you again, it's good for this question for you to draw separate shapes. So for this case, right, I will ignore the horizontal part of the AS curve. So I'll just focus on the diagonal part as well as the vertical part. Okay, so it's YS. So currently you are here and currently the GPL is here. So this time, right, you're going to shift the AS curve to the left. Okay, so you can see when the AS curve shifts to the left, there's a rise in general price level as well as a fall in income. So for this explanation, you want to obviously focus on the rise in general price level, but this time you're going to explain it differently. So if you want to use Singapore as an example, right, the SEED approach, you could argue many ways. So the easiest, I think, for Singapore to explain is called wage push inflation. So if I'm you, right, we all know that ever since maybe 2014, 2013, 2013, 14, 15, Singaporeans Singapore is tightening the inflow of foreign workers in the sense that the foreign workers population continue to grow, but it is now growing at a slower rate. So the problem is this: when the foreign workers come in at a slower rate, right, the labor market will become tighter. When we say a tight labor market, what we mean is this: there are more firms looking for workers than workers looking for firms. So when that happens, right, it is easier for, let's say, the current workers, the existing Singapore workers, to ask for wage increase. Okay, even if their productivity growth, right, didn't increase by more. So, if, for example, right, if my productivity growth, or I only grow by, let's say, 1%, okay, but I can, as a worker, right, I can take advantage of what I can see as a tight labor market to ask for a more than 1% increase in my wages. Okay, the employer is more likely to agree, because if they don't agree and you quit, right, given that the labor market is tight, it is harder for your employer, for your boss, to seek alternative workers to join the firm. So now, if the employer agrees that to grant you a wage increase over and above the productivity increase, that will lead to wage push inflation. That will shift the SRAS from this curve to this curve. So you can see that as a result, right, factor costs would have to go up for your employer, for all the firms. And when that happens, they will pass the higher factor cost to the consumers in the form of higher prices. So this is how you explain the supply side reason in Singapore based on the wage push inflation.